Hello and welcome to Greenomics, a podcast from Oxford Economics where we delve into the complex relationships between climate, nature, and our global economy. I'm your host, Sarah Nelson, in the Economics and Sustainability team here at Oxford Economics, and together we'll be navigating the changing landscape of the green transition. Each month, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to discuss one aspect of sustainability and unpack what it means for businesses in today's economy. Today, we'll be discussing the relationship between nature and one of the biggest sectors in the global economy, tourism. Anyone who has taken a holiday to a beautiful landscape, clear water beach, or snowy ski resort will know that a lot of tourism relies on a good state of nature. Joining me to discuss the industry's efforts to understand, quantify, and improve this relationship are Chris Imson from the World Travel and Tourism Council and Matt Tinsley from Oxford Economics. Chris is Director of Sustainability at WTTC and has been working with destinations to promote sustainable tourism. Matt is a lead economist here at Oxford Economics, where he's been building out our economic understanding of the nature dependency of the sector. All three of us have actually been working very closely together over the last 6 months or so on a study of travel and tourism's global footprint. This study provides an enormous database of environmental and social impacts of tourism across almost 200 countries and is available online if listeners are interested. Chris, Matt, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to start by just unpacking the relationship between tourism and nature a little bit more. Matt, from an economics perspective, can you tell me what we mean when we say the tourism industry?
Sure. So, broadly speaking, the tourism industry is everything involved in helping people go to destinations and spend leisure time in tourism destinations. Now, inherently, travel and tourism are kind of very closely connected. There's a lot of and therefore analysed together. There's quite a lot of travel which may not be for leisure purposes, but the whole of travel and tourism really encompasses everything involved in transporting people, often through flights or land transport, hotels and restaurants and bars, activities people take part in, things like that. When we're looking at the economic terms, what we tend to do in these sorts of areas is follow the demand. And this really is based on what people are spending their money on. So they're spending money on flights and hotels and meals, and also activities and experiences. Bringing all these things together and looking at their kind of economic footprint is really what we mean about the tourism industry from an economic perspective.
If I could just add something there. At WTTC, typically we don't address it as the tourism industry, but rather the travel and tourism sector, because it's actually much more than the companies that make up the industry. It's a part of the economy that spans that private sector, but also the public and civil society across the functions, that vary from tourism occasionally, but also culture, environment, interior, foreign affairs, transport, digital economy, and so on. So it's just a much more all-encompassing phenomenon.
So that's really interesting, actually. So WTTC kind of looks at like a really broad definition of travel and tourism, and all of the contributing factors in that. So Chris, I mean, especially given that broad perspective, how do you kind of think about sustainability across travel and tourism?
Right. Well, I think you can always go back to that very handy definition that sustainability is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations, and that's a helpful starting point. And then, of course, as with everything, the devil is in the details. But this sustainability then needs to be measured across what is typically referred to as that triple bottom line of environmental, social, and economic factors. So that's how we go about it, and I think that we'll have a chance to dig a little bit more into our approach, our joint approach on trying to understand this phenomenon and quantify it together. But I just add that while this notion of sustainable tourism is great and sustainability in general, it's an important notion. I have really grown to like the idea of responsible tourism or stewardship, because to be honest, I think tourism can be, and anything can be sustainable just by dumb luck. I mean, take a destination, just might happen that they have very few and responsible visitors who go there in general, or that they got lucky with their building materials, or that water isn't a scarce resource, for example. But with responsible tourism or with stewardship, this implies a conscious effort to improve the place where you operate. And I think that this, this need to demonstrate our ability to improve really came to the fore with the whole overcrowding debate that was there before COVID and now has come back as a really top line issue in the travel and tourism space. So the onus now is on our sector to demonstrate that we are a force for good and that we can make places better places to live, because ultimately a better place to live is also a better place to visit. So yes, in short, I like this idea of moving from passive to active.
And I'd just like to touch on that idea of a sustainable travel and tourism sector. There's quite a lot of coverage of kind of ecotourism destinations, and so when you want to describe a sustainable, or as you put it, a responsible sector, is that all destinations become ecotourism, or it's that all destinations adopt more kind of forward-looking or sustainable practices in general?
Yeah, I think that ecotourism is just kind of a niche within all of that, right? I think that ecotourism conjures up images of a full engagement with nature, but there's a lot of, and this is another area that we're working on as well. It's we like to call it nature positive travel and tourism, because you don't need to be an eco tourist venture. You just need to have these kind of nature safeguards within your operations. You can be operating fully within an urban context, but you have appropriate water practices. You're not polluting the environment around you and affecting biodiversity and nature, for example. So you don't need to think, again, it's much more than a direct engagement with a nature-based activity.
I guess there's parallels to the wider economy where not everybody has to be in a green, industry, but everybody going forward, hopefully, will have to adopt green practices.
Precisely. That's exactly what we want people to recognize and act on that.
This is a question for both of you. Matt, maybe starting with you. Why is it important to measure tourism's environmental impacts?
So fundamentally, I think it comes from the idea that in order to improve anything, you have to understand where it is currently. So, we talked about the kind of different channels of kind of economic footprint that the industry has. Understanding how that translates into environmental kind of, whether it's environmental concerns in the form of pollution, greenhouse gas emissions. It's obviously in terms of kind of water use. There's quite a diverse selection of ways in which the different components of the tourism industry can have environmental footprints. So simply going with assumptions or not having a kind of evidence-based foundation means that in all likelihood you're going to miss the most important perspective. So really building that evidence base, recognizing that the evidence base may look quite different in different places, whether that's because of the different sorts of environmental assets that are locally, as Chris mentioned, the idea of the different priorities of somewhere that has water scarcity issues, but lots of kind of renewable energy, compared to one that relies heavily on fossil fuel energy but doesn't have water scarcity issues, present very different pictures. Having those kind of nuanced understandings across the range of impacts and the ways different destinations will vary is going to be very important in terms of knowing what to address.
And Chris, from a WTTC perspective, does that line up with your?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I could just give a little bit of background on the World Travel and Tourism Council. So we are the trade association representing the global travel and tourism private sector. And, as with any good superhero, we also have an origin story. And that was that these four distinguished CEOs of Amex, American Airlines, Marriott, and British Airways, they met with the former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, of all people, to impress upon him the importance of travel and tourism. And he said, that's all well and good, but why don't you come back to me once you have a common story backed up by evidence? And that really was how we formed 30 years ago. That is our raison d'etre, to generate evidence to back up the importance of travel and tourism. And we've been doing that pretty well ever since, together with Oxford Economics, measuring tourism in terms of arrivals, spend, and GDP. But this data, whilst it's great, it's not arguably not good enough any longer. That's what our members who give us our mandate have told us, and they are the CEOs and presidents of over 200 of the largest movers and shakers within this sector. They're telling us we need to understand travel and tourism in a much more holistic manner. And so I mentioned earlier this triple bottom line. Well, we need to find the balance across that, because in an ideal world, tourism has positive impacts across the board, but inevitably there will be costs. So we need to make sure that the trade-off is acceptable. For example, there will be some environmental damage, but is that offset by an increase in local income and the ability to reinvest in conservation, for example? And also, we need to make sure that we're continually reducing that cost. And that's why we're so excited about this data that we've created together with Oxford Economics and with the generous support of Saudi Arabia, because essentially this tells us for every dollar that travel and tourism generates in the economy, what was its corresponding footprint across a whole range of environmental and social indicators, from greenhouse gas emissions to water to pollutants to material extraction, the age, wage, and gender profiles of tourism employment. And with this data, so just to give you an example in practice of what it's telling us now and how we can move forward with that, well, the good news is that across the board, we're seeing a decoupling of resource use from growth. That's what we want to see, right? So, for example, in 2010, 0.62 kilos of greenhouse gas emissions were emitted for every dollar that travel and tourism generated in the global economy. That's now at 0.48 kilos in 2021. So we're seeing that the intensity is going down, but we need to move much, much faster. In fact, intensity can still go down whilst absolutes go up. What we need to see is that absolutes go down. So we have this messaging, and we also see where these impacts are being felt. So, for example, in greenhouse gas emissions, 40% unsurprisingly is in transport, 20% is in utilities. Where you get most bang for your buck probably is in new generation fuels, SAF, electrification of transport, or renewable energy on our grids. Same with water. We saw that 81% is in the supply chain of water use, and of that 81%, another 81% is in agriculture. So where we get bang for our buck there is working with our supply chains, sourcing sustainably. I don't think we're saying anything revolutionary here, but you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So, and this data is really helping us paint that picture very clearly.
How responsive are the destinations that you work with, or as you said, the supply chains that you work with, to this data and to adopting new practices to try to reduce their impacts?
Oh, that's a good question. So the data is relatively new, right? So and it's very expansive. So we're currently in a process of socializing this data, making people understand what they have at their fingertips, and we have worked together with one destination. I think I can happily say who they are here, Puerto Rico, who have used their report and have found that this has been an incredibly useful engagement tool. The DMO, the NTO, the National Tourism Organization, has used it to engage with port authorities, with aviation authorities, and so on. They're bringing evidence to the table as they discuss their plans going forward. So we know that it has enormous potential for being used, but beyond that, sustainability data, that is a very, very big subject and a complicated one, and one that is preoccupying a lot of people, I think, primarily because of the shift now towards mandatory reporting requirements, particularly in the EU with the CSRD. So that's top of mind of, if not CEOs, at least your CSOs across the globe now.
I guess an evidence base, as you put it, like this will just become increasingly important as people have to make those changes over time.
I mean, yeah, if you have the evidence to show that the need is required, then there's not much argument against it any longer, right? Otherwise it's hearsay.
To understand what Oxford Economics is doing to measure tourism and its impacts and dependencies on nature, I spoke to Jessie Smith, an economist in our tourism economics practice. Jessie, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me, what does tourism economics do exactly?
So tourism economics offers a variety of services which kind of cover expertise in and around the travel and tourism industry. We cover both kind of data subscription side, and then also consulting work. So within our subscription side, we'd offer products like the Global Travel Service. So that looks at kind of country level travel forecasts that look at visitor numbers and spending, and then kind of some more granular indicators, as well as GCT, which is a city level similar forecast, APF, air passenger flows, and then we've recently launched a cruise service too. And then on the consulting side, we offer a really quite broad range of bespoke consulting pieces. They kind of cover economic impact, market studies, and visa policy analysis.
And your modeling, is it driven by kind of tourism demand?
Yeah, so we kind of have a multi-pronged approach of we bring in our macro drivers from the Oxford Economics macro model, and then combine that with more tourism specific drivers. So within the macro side, you have things like middle class incomes. We kind of view tourism as a luxury good. So middle class incomes are kind of the proportion of the population of a given country that we see are a prospective outbound market. And then we also look at previous tourism data. So what are the top level visitor flows? What's our BOP data showing for kind of inbound travel spending and transport? And then we kind of marry those two together along with keeping an eye on markets and looking at kind of visa policy changes and that kind of thing that might not necessarily be captured in the two things that have been previously mentioned.
So it's a combination of historical trends and demand drivers, as well as sort of regulation layered on top of that.
Yeah, exactly that. Yes. And looking at things like if we see sort of expansions in air routes and that kind of thing, where we might not be able to capture that until it comes into the data otherwise. But yeah, it's kind of marrying up a few different sources.
Sounds very comprehensive. I mean, as you know, the topic of this episode is sort of nature. So what is TE doing in the kind of nature sphere?
So while natural resources have always been a factor within our thinking about the relative destination attractiveness, more recently we've kind of begun to think of absolute attractiveness of a destination, owning not only to its natural resources, but also to a range of other factors, such as environmental sustainability and climate. So as has been previously mentioned with our kind of demand drivers, a destination attractiveness is something that we already have in there, and that's been in there for a while. But we're looking at flexing that more in line with climate scenarios to try and kind of capture that change. So to go into that a little bit more, we have the destination competitiveness indexes, which are within our demand drivers, and they cover a few things. So natural and cultural capital, environment and infrastructure, prioritization of travel and tourism, researchers, IT readiness, that kind of thing. And they kind of look at a given country relative to the global average. So looking at how relatively competitive a destination is. Now, we've had them in the model for a while, but they have been more static than dynamic. And we're now looking at kind of expanding them out over various different climate scenarios so that we can look at how a destination's competitiveness under one of those pillars changes under different scenarios.
So I understand the sort of underlying assumption there is that the conditions of nature affect how attractive a destination is for inbound tourists.
Exactly that, yeah.
Does it also take into account any sort of dependency of the tourism industry of continuing production or any supply chains or anything like that at this stage? Is that something you're looking at?
Yeah, I think that's something that's kind of more in the pile of things that we'll be able to look at. Yeah. Because I think, when you start considering how the climate affects tourism demand, there's so many different directions that we can start going in. So kind of outside of those environmental pillars and alongside kind of bringing in the macroeconomic drivers. So obviously we have the climate service. So we have a lot of macroeconomic drivers that we have in our model. We can pull scenario specific drivers from the climate service. But then even within that, we know that we see divergence between top level macro trends and travel trends, right? So like if you look at the pandemic, that's a prime example. So we won't quite capture everything we need to capture there. So kind of we have, we've got our macroeconomic layer, we've got our kind of destination competitiveness index. Another kind of strand of things that we're looking at is pricing. So obviously pricing is a crucial consideration. And we're in the process of bringing in staff costs into our air passenger forecast.
So that's sustainable aviation fuel?
Yes. Right. So kind of the air passenger forecast is something I've mentioned previously, but we can use our air passenger forecast model to look at how we expect our bilateral, so that's source market mix changes in our kind of environmental or like our climate forecasts. So stepping that back, if we look at how we change sustainable aviation fuel as a share of our total and the impacts we see that come in through the pricing mechanisms, we can look at how our demand for different bilateral pairs changes. And then we can kind of feed that through into our global travel service so that we then have kind of our pricing impacts coming through in that dimension too. Because obviously we're expecting to see that is something that will change quite considerably under different climate scenarios.
That is super interesting. Sort of technological, sort of micro example of a massive macro trend, which I think is fascinating and will be super sort of relevant to both destinations and travel companies, and anybody who's looking at how aviation can continue in a world that trends towards net zeros. So yeah, great example, and really sort of great to hear about what you're doing over there.
Yeah. And then I think maybe the final thing to cover would also be that, climate in itself is an inherent driver of destination demand. So like take Spain, for example, Spain's climate, as well as a myriad of other factors, are destination drivers, like for a specific destination, right? So we're utilizing the Tourism Climate Index framework, which is kind of an academic framework to look at temporal change in different destinations under different climate scenarios, so that then we can kind of dig a bit more into the temperature elasticity of demand. So yeah, which is kind of like another layer to what we're covering.
So for the non-economists out there,
yes.
The temperature elasticity of demand, to confirm, is kind of the response of tourism demand to temperature in different destinations.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly that. So and obviously, that comes with a host of different things, because even just within a given year, you see temperature demand. So say we look at Europe in the past year, we saw Spain hitting 40 degrees. France hitting 40 degrees for the first time in kind of known history. And there was a lot of discussion about how's that going to change travel trends. Now, one of the kind of most immediate things is people can start traveling a little bit more in the shoulder season. So it might be that we don't see a total volume change, but actually when within the year when people actually do travel does change. So people prefer to be in May and September, October, rather than in a peak temperature month of August, for example. So obviously there's quite a lot to consider here, and kind of the common type of holiday destination that a destination might be is really important. So, beach versus city versus snow, and also like how much that temperature change might affect that destination is also really important. So, if we're looking at a skiing destination, a temperature shift that goes over kind of your snow limit has a really, really detrimental effect, where, a similar temperature change in a beach destination or a city destination might not be so much, before we even get into kind of building adaptation and what the building stock's like for kind of different temperatures. But yeah, so that's kind of the final part of the bits that we're digging into at the moment, but it's quite wide ranging.
Quite wide ranging indeed. Well, I'm really looking forward to sort of seeing the outputs of that research, Jessie, and thank you so much for joining me today and describing what you've been doing in tourism economics.
Well, thanks for having me.
So one thing that came up in the conversation with Jessie is that environmental state or environmental attractiveness is a key determinant of tourism markets and tourism prospects. Matt, how is tourism generally dependent on a good state of nature?
So nowadays, tourists have a lot of choice about where they might go in the world, where they might travel to, and what activities they might engage in. If I'm looking at going on a scuba diving holiday, I care quite a lot about the quality of marine life, the broader quality of nature in the destination, and therefore the attractiveness to me as that type of tourist is going to be very much driven by the quality of nature, and also the reputation. Obviously, that's how I as a tourist might be hearing about it from overseas. So I think these sorts of push and pull factors that determine whether a tourist might go somewhere are often very much focused on nature, and there's a real risk factor that comes with any kind of environmental degradation, a negative reputation that a destination might have, simply because tourists have enough choice to go to other destinations and get something potentially better.
So this is kind of reflects a discussion that I had in an earlier episode about the financial sector. But it seems like tourism impacts on nature, as we've just discussed, but nature also impacts on tourism. Do you think about it in this kind of bi-directional relationship?
Yeah, so I mean, double materiality, which is really what you're describing, is what exists when an organization or an industry both contributes to an environmental concern, such as climate change or biodiversity loss, as well as being impacted by it. Now, virtually every driver of economic activity it has some sort of environmental impact. Tourism's environmental impact, though, can be seen on a few different levels. Yes, there's climate change through greenhouse gas emissions, but actually within specific destinations, to use one of Chris's words, the stewardship of nature in a given destination will determine how attractive that destination is. Therefore, they're having an impact as well as being impacted by through the attractiveness to tourists. So there is that two-way relationship. I think what's really missing is an evidence-based focus on that two-way relationship. The real risk comes that in order to try and maximize income, inward revenues through tourist arrivals, destinations kind of run down their kind of local amenities, the quality of nature where they are, to the extent that actually the economic losses is kind of set in and that it can't be recovered because nature can't bounce back quickly enough. So that's what the real risk that comes with a failure to understand the importance of nature to attract tourists and the real kind of nuances of that double materiality.
Yeah, if I could add to that, we have been running a kind of a nature positive tourism initiative within WTTC, and now together with UN Tourism and the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance, and we've carried out a great number of consultations as part of that, and we've developed some guidance, and I think it's come out very clearly that there is a general understanding amongst everyone that tourism and nature depend on each other. As we mentioned, tourism has a key role to play in nature conservation and regeneration. And I mean, after all, what other sector gives nature an economic reason to continue to exist more or less in its original state? I can't think of many other sectors that do that, right? If managed well. And of course, nature is critical for tourism. Research shows that 80% of the value of travel and tourism's goods and services are dependent on nature's resources and ecosystems. The exploration of nature accounts for over half of all tours, and nature-based tourism is predicted to generate $665 billion annually by 2030. These are big sums, and we saw what happened during COVID when this income dried up. There was an increase in poaching. There was less money for guards, less money for maintenance. So one way to think about it is that nature is the book, and tourism is the publisher, and they depend on each other fully. You can't publish without a book, and if you have a book without a publisher, well, it's not going to get very far, right? So that understanding is there, but as I said, this kind of systematic measurement, for example, of ecosystem services, we haven't seen that. The question is not really whether they're related; it's how to better understand and manage that relationship, right? Beyond understanding that income can be used to fund conservation, how do companies start to really understand their impacts and dependencies, and that double materiality that we've been talking about? And that really is a complicated situation that requires collaboration at destination levels because tourism businesses aren't conservation NGOs. They aren't biologists. They're tourism businesses. They need support in trying to understand these issues as well.
And have you worked with any particular company? I don't know if you can, name names, but have you worked with any particular companies who are doing particularly well in understanding or moving particularly quickly in understanding their nature dependency?
Yes, I mean there are many companies, and I don't want to name one or two because that would, at the risk of leaving out a bunch of others, right? At WTTC we have a lot of very forward-thinking members amongst our membership who are taking this whole issue of nature positive very seriously, and many of them, are forerunners of the whole ecotourism movement, right? Switching nature-based tourism into actual a meaningful type of tourism that supports local communities, that supports local ecosystems. So there's a whole bunch of them, but I think that where you see that working best is where the destination gets it too. You know, it's not enough for just a business to go in and do it. There needs to be that destination connect. And so, you know, one destination where this has worked very well, for example, is where we held our summit, the WTTC annual summit last year in Rwanda. So in the 1980s, there were under 200 mountain gorillas left in the world. They were at the brink of extinction from poaching and deforestation, and today there are over 1,600. And the reason the gorillas were saved is simple: it's tourism. You know, since the 1994 genocide, Rwanda's government has pursued a strategy of tourism-led development. It's using its biodiversity, its nature, and in particularly its USP, the gorillas, to attract high-value ecotourism, and working with those businesses that operate there to do this properly, to reinvest that revenue in conservation and community. So farmers who once used to earn a living turning forests into fields are now making more replanting it. People who once used to poach are now getting by as forest guards or guides for the tourism companies that are operating there. Revenue gets poured into community infrastructure. It all improves the overall tourism experience, and it's an inspiring example of how tourism, conservation, and development can go hand in hand. But it's not just the business; it has to be the connection.
And the wider economy, sort of, I mean, some of this relies on, as you put it earlier in the episode, the broader definition of travel and tourism. Some of that relies on policy, on other sectors in the economy. It's quite complex.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those supply chains are incredibly complex, and you know, we've touched on double materiality. We've very briefly flirted with this. You know, the new reporting requirements coming out, the mandatory ones, and what's, you know, particularly interesting at the EU level in particular is that companies that fall under the scope of this reporting will not only need to carry out double materiality reporting, but they'll also need to report on their supply chains. And so getting to grips with that is going to be a big challenge going forward.
Oh, Matt, that's something that I know that we work on in our team. So, where is the industry at in terms of developing quantification tools for understanding, you know, the tourism impacts throughout the supply chain and dependencies throughout the supply chain?
So that's one of the things that we've been focused on in our analysis with WTTC. Historically, we've done quite a lot on the economic footprinting, looking at supply chains, understanding how money that's spent in one part of the economy creates value in other parts of the economy. What that means is that, you know, the agricultural businesses, you know, whilst they may not be just direct recipients of tourism money, will actually be beneficiaries through the kind of supplying, you know, hotels and restaurants, things like that. Now, understanding the mapping of those relationships is quite important. You realize quite quickly that actually the economic benefits are a lot more kind of significant than just the people you know, immediately employed. The other side of it would be the benefits that come through kind of wages being earned, and therefore that kind of rippling through the economy. So quite quickly you have you know an entire community that's very dependent on local tourism, and therefore all the risks that come with the potential loss of tourism through things like nature degradation really ripple through an entire community rather than simply being focused on the immediate kind of companies, you know, for example, hotels and restaurants.
One thing that you touched on there is the kind of social aspect, and it's come up, you know, various times through this episode. But I'm an environmental economist, and I usually think about the environment. But obviously, tourism has a massive, you know, social footprint and a massive potential to improve social outcomes. Chris, is there anything on that WTTC is particularly focused on?
So, social footprint of travel and tourism is a hard nut to crack. I think that destinations and stakeholders around the world are grappling with this question, as we all know, this overcrowding has reemerged as a big issue, and I don't think anyone has solved it in a neat and awe-inspiring manner that is to be replicated across the rest of the world, right? But there are some, you know, issues that lie at the heart of this, and that is local satisfaction with travel and tourism. Now, I don't think that is a particularly easy thing to measure systematically. I think it, you know, involves surveys, possibly, to see where they stand. But then how do you actively encourage local satisfaction. So let me just take a step back. Also, just say if you don't have local satisfaction, what we see is that it becomes mediatized. And the moment it becomes mediatized, it becomes politicized. And the moment it becomes politicized, well, yeah, things become much more complicated than they need to be. So it's all about prevention, right? And there is a very interesting study that came out in Bruges several years ago, before COVID. They were looking at overcrowding in the destination and the tolerance for overcrowding at the time, and they found that of the various measures that helped that tolerance, that helped to increase it, the one that really stood out was political empowerment, or in other words, people feel that they have a say in the matter. The moment they feel that they have been engaged, consulted, simply consulted, they feel that they've been a part of that process, their tolerance increases. When they feel disenfranchised, marginalized, that tolerance drops precipitously. So I suspect a large part of the solution lies precisely in that, making sure that your communities, your local people feel somehow empowered in the whole tourism growth debate.
That's really interesting, the idea of sort of democratizing the sector. That's great. I have one final question for you, and we've sort of touched on it a few times, but looking forward, imagine you had a crystal ball and where we've made a lot of progress to this sustainable tourism sector, travel and tourism sector more broadly. What do you think that'll look like in 2040? Chris, I'll start with you.
Oh, I envisage myself diving in pristine coral reefs.
Don't we all? I hope we're there.
Yeah. No, I just hope that my kid has the opportunity to see the things that I've seen. That's already a win, and that's already up in the air, very much so. So I'll take that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, and in many ways, what we're talking about, having kind of the frameworks to understand the cost to nature, the cost to the environment. If those things are able to cause the minimization of those costs, then actually it becomes a lot more sustainable, not just for local communities, not just for the environment, but actually for tourists themselves. And so, yeah, hopefully a position where we can find solutions to these problems that aren't simply stopping people traveling or making it inhibitively expensive.
So having the evidence base and the policies and the actions and the options to get to a world where us and our children can enjoy all of the tourism destinations.
And where sustainability isn't the premium option, is the default option.
Well, I think that is a really great way to end it. But before I let you go, I'm going to have to subject you to the Greenomics gamble. And Chris, believe it or not, you actually stole one of my statements that I was going to give you when you were giving some of those numbers, which serves me right for looking at WTTC. But anyway, I have two statements now. One of which is true and one of which is false. And so I'm going to ask you to sort of guess which one is the lie. The first statement is that the US's national parks set a record in 2021 with 300 million visits over the year. Touches on the over-tourism point, perhaps. And the second statement is that 1 in 20 people globally work in jobs linked to tourism. What do we think?
I feel like Chris probably knows the answer to the second
probably.
one. I feel like that's probably a
fair.
statistic he's wheeled out before.
I think in 2019 at its peak, 1 in 10 jobs were contributed by travel and tourism, and it's now at 1 in 11 or something like this following COVID. I should know that number off the top of my heart.
Yeah, feels a little bit like asking the expert exactly the statistics that he knows. So yes, that is absolutely correct. 1 in 20 was a big underestimate. So thank you very much for sharing all of those insights and a really interesting discussion both. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you also to the listeners for tuning in. Please do subscribe on Spotify, SoundCloud, or on our website, and feel free to email us at podcasts@oxfordeconomics.com. That's it for today on Greenomics from Oxford Economics, where we know that money might make the world go round, but sustainability makes it a much nicer place to live. See you next time.